Hello everyone! Today we will talk about curvature, its basic properties and how it controls the behavior of geodesics. We will start with an abstract discussion, then go over some algebraic properties, and then try to understand the geometric meaning of curvature. In a Riemannian manifold, if we have two vector fields x and y, the curvature operator of x and y is going to be the linear map from the set of vector fields to itself given by this formula. It is the commutator of the nablas minus nabla of the commutator. The derivative first in the direction of y and then in the direction of x, minus the one in the reverse order, and minus the derivative in the direction of the Lie bracket. It would be very difficult to get geometric information directly out of this formula, but curvature controls all the geometric aspects of a Riemannian manifold, and today I want to start exploring how this happens. The first thing that we will do is to prove some important algebraic properties of the curvature operator. Rxy is not just a linear function from vector fields to vector fields, it is infinity linear. If we apply Rxy to fz, we can expand by applying the Leibniz rule of nabla. If we do it twice, we get this expression. Many terms will cancel, and using the definition of Lie bracket, we can cancel these other terms. In the end, we get f times Rxyz. This means that the value of Rxyz at a point P does not change if we change the value of z outside of P. In other words, if there was another vector field z' with the property that z and z' agree at P, then Rxyz and Rxyz' would agree at P. This infinity linearity is not only enjoyed by z, but also by x and y. This computation is a little shorter. We start with Rfxyz. We use the properties of nabla and the Lie bracket, and then the Leibniz rule. Some terms will cancel, and we get what we wanted. Something I haven't mentioned that is quite easy to show is that Rxy is minus Ryx. This is immediate from the formula. Because of this, this infinity linearity at x also applies to y. All of this implies that even though the formula of Rxyz is quite long and messy, the value at a point P only depends on the values of x, y, and z at P. Now let's see what happens when we have local coordinates. We know that the partial derivatives in the coordinate directions commute, so r partial I partial j simplifies to nabla partial I nabla partial j minus nabla partial j nabla partial I. Something similar will happen when we consider the covariant derivatives with respect to a smooth map phi that is not necessarily a chart. Remember that in the last lesson we defined the covariant derivatives in the coordinate directions for such maps. In this setting, we will show that r phi star ei phi star ej is the difference between di dj and dj di. This will be a computation using a chart, and the properties we already showed for the curvature. Just like in the last lesson, we use the letters ti for the variables in the domain of phi and the letters xi for the variables in the local coordinates in M with respect to a chart. By the chain rule, we have these expressions for phi star ei and phi star ej, which we can plug in the left-hand side of the formula we want to show. By the properties of the curvature we already established, we get this expression, and then substitute the formula for r in local coordinates. On the other hand, if we take di dj is d, by the properties of the covariant derivative, the dj can be replaced by nabla phi star ej. We use the expression in local coordinates and expand using the Leibniz rule for the covariant derivatives. Again, we put this in terms of nabla and use the expression of phi star ei in local coordinates. Using the properties of nabla, we can expand to this expression. The computation for dj di goes exactly the same way, and we obtain this. Finally, when we take the difference, the term involving the second partial derivatives cancels, and we get what we wanted to show. Okay, those are enough computations for now. Let's do an experiment. We start in R2 and take two orthonormal vectors v and w. The geodesic gamma w is the line in the direction of w, and the parallel transport of v along gamma w is simply a family of copies of v along that line. When we take the geodesics with those initial conditions, we get a bunch of parallel lines. If we put them into a function phi, it will have this expression. Phi of st is sw plus tv. The derivative of phi with respect to s at 0t is w, whose length does not depend on t, reflecting the fact that these lines are parallel. Let's repeat this experiment in the unit sphere. We take two orthonormal vectors v and w tangent to the sphere. In this picture, the geodesic gamma w is the equator, and the parallel transport of v along that equator is a bunch of parallel vectors, which as vectors in R3 are just copies of v. Then when we take the geodesics gamma v tilde, they are meridians, which are not parallel anymore. They start getting closer as soon as they leave the equator. This is a phenomenon that we will see in positive curvature. When we put these geodesics together in a single function phi, the derivative of phi with respect to s at 0t is a vector field whose length is a concave function of t and has a maximum at t equals 0, reflecting the fact that these geodesics get closer as soon as they start flowing. Now let's do this again in the ball model of the hyperbolic plane. If v and w are based at the origin, gamma w is a straight line and v tilde is a collection of unit vectors perpendicular to the geodesic gamma w. When we take the geodesics with these initial conditions, we see a bunch of circles that spread away from each other. This is the exact opposite of what we saw in the sphere, and is a phenomenon of negative curvature. Again, if we construct the function phi and take the derivative with respect to s along 0t, we get a vector field whose length is a convex function that has a minimum at 0. Before we do this again in general, I would like to first say what do I mean by positive and negative curvature. For a pair of orthonormal vectors v and w tangent to a manifold, we define the sectional curvature of those two vectors as the inner product between rwvv and w. With this definition, let's repeat that construction we already did 3 times. Take two orthonormal vectors v and w, take gamma w, the geodesic in the direction of w, v tilde the parallel transport of v along gamma w, and let phi of st be given by gamma v tilde s at t. So for a fixed s, phi of st is the geodesic with initial velocity v tilde of s. We call f of t the length of the derivative of phi with respect to s at 0t. This length will tell us how these geodesics spread out. If f is constant, that means that these geodesics are equidistant just like parallel lines. If f is concave, this means that the geodesics are getting together like in the sphere, and if f is convex, the geodesics are spreading out like in the hyperbolic plane. It turns out that the second derivative of f is given by minus the sectional curvature of v and w. In other words, when the sectional curvature is positive, the geodesics get together like in the sphere, and when the sectional curvature is negative, the geodesics spread out like in the hyperbolic plane. To check that f at 0 is 1, we simply use the definition of phi, the fact that v tilde of s is based at gamma w of s, and then the fact that gamma w has initial velocity w. To take the derivative of f, we use the chain rule and then the Leibniz rule for the covariant derivatives. We will show that this term dt partial phi partial s is 0 at 0. To see this, remember we proved last lesson that dt partial phi partial s equals ds partial phi partial t. We use the definition of phi and then the fact that at time t0 the velocity of gamma v tilde is v tilde. Since we chose v tilde to be a parallel vector field, this is 0. Because of this, we can deduce that f prime at 0 is 0. Now we compute the second derivative of f using the quotient rule and the Leibniz rule. It is a long formula, but at time 0 most terms will cancel and we get this simple expression. We again use the fact that we proved last lesson and then the expression for the curvature in terms of the covariant derivatives. Something nice is that we have the second derivative of phi with respect to t here. Remember that for each s, the curve phi of st was a geodesic, so this term is 0. The derivatives of phi at 0 are v and w, so we can substitute that and then use the fact that if we switch the first two inputs in the curvature operator, we get a minus sign. This proves the proposition and establishes the meaning of sectional curvature in terms of geodesics. We will come back to sectional curvature later, but first we will introduce another notion of curvature, the Ricci curvature. Pick a unit vector v and take an orthonormal basis that starts with v, that is, e1, e2, e3, and so on, with e1 equal to v. Then the Ricci curvature in the direction of v is defined as the sum of the sectional curvatures of the pairs v2, v3, and so on. Since we know the meaning of sectional curvature in terms of geodesics, we can also understand the Ricci curvature in terms of how geodesics spread. We take all of the geodesics that start with a direction parallel to v and compute how much they spread out on average. If they get close to gamma v, we have positive Ricci curvature, and if they get further from gamma v, we have negative Ricci curvature. It may happen that some geodesics get closer and some geodesics get further. This happens when some sectional curvatures are positive and others negative. In this picture, the sectional curvature of v and this basis vector is positive because these geodesics are getting closer, and the sectional curvature of v and this other vector is negative because these geodesics are getting further. On average, the Ricci curvature in this direction may be 0. Later in this lesson, we will prove that the Ricci curvature does not depend on the orthonormal basis we take in the definition. The Ricci curvature also has a description in terms of areas. Take B, a small ball in the orthogonal complement of V in TPM. We can again construct a vector field V tilde over exp of V that is parallel along the geodesics passing through P, and take the collection of geodesics with those initial conditions. Again, we can put all of these geodesics together into a single function phi. For a time t, we call St the image of the ball B at time t, and analyze its area as a function of time. Then again, f is concave when these geodesics get together on average, and convex when they spread out on average. It turns out that the second derivative of f is given by minus the Ricci curvature in the direction of v. In here, we have to say approximately rather than equal, because in order to get the equality, we need to take the limit as the radius of the ball B goes to 0. The proof of this fact requires a little more effort than the one for sectional curvature, so we'll leave that for later. We come back to the curvature operator and define the curvature tensor applied to 4 vector fields x, y, z, and w as the inner product of r, x, y, z, and w, and we denote it by rm, x, y, z, w. Using this definition, when v and w are orthonormal, the sectional curvature of vw is rm, w, v, v, w. We will show that rm, x, y, z, w is minus rm, x, y, w, z. This is a long computation, but is a simple consequence of the fact that the connection is compatible with the metric. To prove it, we first prove that rm, x, y, z, z is 0. We use compatibility with the metric 3 times and some terms will cancel. Then we use compatibility with the metric again, and by the definition of Lie bracket, this is 0. To prove that rm, x, y, z, w plus rm, x, y, w, z is 0, we use the linearity of each coordinate to write this expression as a sum of 3 expressions we know are 0 from the first part. As a consequence of this, if we have 2 orthonormal vectors v and w, the sectional curvature of vw is the same as the sectional curvature of wv. Moreover, we can define the sectional curvature for any pair of vectors vw as long as they are linearly independent. We simply have to normalize by this quantity, which is the square of the area of the parallelogram spanned by those 2 vectors. For orthonormal vectors, this is consistent with our previous definition because the area of the square spanned by them is 1. What is really nice about this definition is that this quantity does only depend on the 2-dimensional plane spanned by those 2 vectors and not on the basis we use. To prove that, note that we can pass from one basis to another by elementary transformations, swapping the vectors, adding one vector to the other, or rescaling one vector. These 3 transformations do not change the value of the sectional curvature, so it is well defined as a function of the 2-dimensional plane. Now it is time to prove that the Ricci curvature was well defined. For vectors v1 and v2, we can take the bilinear map that takes w1, w2 to rm v1, w1, w2, v2. Using the metric, this bilinear map comes from a unique linear map that we call LV1V2. The Ricci tensor applied to V1V2 is defined as the trace of this linear map. We don't have a nice geometric description of the Ricci tensor, but it is well defined and bilinear, and we will use it to prove that the Ricci curvature was well defined. If we have a unit vector v and an orthonormal basis e1, e2, and so on that starts with v, we can compute the Ricci curvature in the direction v with respect to this basis. Using the definition of LVV, we see that this coincides with the Ricci tensor applied to VV, which does not depend on the basis we took because the trace of a linear map is independent of bases. The last thing we will prove in this lesson is that the Ricci tensor is symmetric. To do that, we need to come back to the curvature operator. The Bianchi identity states that if we have three vector fields x, y, z, rx, y, z plus ry, dx plus rs, dx, y is 0. In other words, if we cycle the three vector fields x, y, and z around the three positions in the curvature operator, the sum is 0. The proof is quite simple and only uses the fact that the connection is torsion-free. We start by expanding using the definition of curvature and use the torsion-free property. Then we use the torsion-free property a second time to get an expression that involves only the Lie brackets. We then expand this expression using the definition of Lie bracket and everything cancels. With the Bianchi identity, we can prove another property of the curvature tensor. Rmxyzdw equals Rmzdwxy, meaning that we can swap the first two entries with the last two entries. To prove this, we apply the Bianchi identity 4 times. We change the sign of the second and third expressions and add everything. Everything cancels out except for the terms we care about. Now we are ready to prove that the Ricci tensor is symmetric. We simply apply the definition of LV1V2 and the symmetry of the curvature tensor we just proved. This shows that swapping V1 and V2 takes L to its adjoint. Since the trace of a linear map is the same as the trace of its adjoint, we are done. We have proved many properties of the curvature tensor. Let's put them all together. For any vector fields x, y, z, w, Rm is antisymmetric in the first two entries, antisymmetric in the last two entries. If we cycle the first three entries, they add up to 0, and we can swap the first two entries with the last two entries. I still have many things I want to say about curvature, but those will go in a later lesson. Thank you for watching and see you next time.